I pressed my trembling fingers against the cold, unyielding wood of the ceremonial altar, the scent of pine and old stone filling my lungs with each ragged breath. His voice, a low rumble that vibrated through the floor and up my spine, washed over me. With this vow, I bind you to me, to my pack, to my bloodline. Alpha Kale of the Black Moon Pack did not look at me. His storm-gray eyes were fixed on the ancient moonstone that symbolized our union, his chiseled profile as severe and unforgiving as the mountain his fortress was carved into. I was a sacrifice, a debt paid in flesh and vows. My family, my home, my entire world was balanced on the two words I was about to say, and the weight of it was crushing me. "I do," I whispered, the sound stolen by the vastness of the hall, a ghost of a promise from a girl who had already become a ghost of herself. The moment the words left my lips, his gaze finally snapped to mine, and in their depths I saw not triumph, not possession, but a raw, desolate hunger that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with me. It was the look of a wolf who had just trapped his own heart in a snare, and I was the bait. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected claims, broken bonds, or awakenings under the moon, subscribe and stay close. Now, back to the scene. The binding was complete. Kale's large, calloused hand released my arm, the brief touch leaving a trail of icy fire on my skin. He turned away without another word, his broad back a wall of black leather and sheer authority, and strode from the great hall. There was no kiss, no celebration, no pretense of joy. The elders of his pack, stoic and grim-faced, merely nodded before dispersing into the shadows, their silence a heavier condemnation than any jeer. I was left alone, standing before the altar in a borrowed white dress that felt more like a burial shroud. This was my new life, the Luna of the Black Moon Pack, wife to the most feared and ruthless alpha in the 5 territories. My name was Ilara of the Silverwood Pack, and I was 21 years old. Or, at least, I had been, until I stepped over the threshold of this cold stone fortress. Now I was just a title, a treaty, a solution to a problem my father's pride had created. Our pack had been failing for years. Sickness had claimed many of our warriors, a blight had withered our crops, and my father, Alpha Ronin, was weakened by a lung fever that stole his strength and his spirit. We had borrowed heavily from the Black Moon Pack, a desperate measure to keep our people fed. But Kale was not a benevolent lender. When the final debt came due, he had offered my father an alternative to being absorbed and stripped of his title. My hand in marriage. A union to strengthen ties. It was a lie. It was a conquest disguised as an alliance. He was taking our most valuable asset, an alpha's daughter, and leaving us with just enough pride to choke on. My father had wept when you told me, his shame a palpable thing in the small room. I had not. I had simply nodded, my heart packing itself away in a cold, dark place where nothing could touch it. A stern-faced woman with graying hair pulled into a tight bun appeared at my side. "The Alpha awaits you in his chambers, Luna," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. Her name was Greta, Kale's head of household, and her eyes held a mixture of pity and contempt. I followed her through a labyrinth of stone corridors, the flickering torchlight casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock my every step. The fortress was a marvel of grim engineering, built into the heart of a mountain, intimidating and impregnable. It was a reflection of its master, We arrived before a set of massive ironwood doors. Greta pushed one open and gestured for me to enter, then pulled it shut behind me, the heavy thud echoing with finality. The room was vast and surprisingly Spartan for an alpha of his stature. A massive bed with a dark fur throw dominated one wall. A fireplace crackled on another, and a large balcony offered a breathtaking, terrifying view of the moonlit valley below. Cale stood by that balcony, his back to me, a silhouette against the starry sky. "You may have the adjoining room," he said, his voice flat, still not turning. He gestured with his head toward another door I hadn't noticed. "Your belongings have been taken there. You will find everything you need." I stood frozen, confused. This wasn't what I had prepared for. I had steeled myself for a brute, for a man who would take his prize with the same ruthlessness he took territory. I had expected to be claimed, used, and discarded. "I don't understand," I finally managed to say, my voice small. He turned then, and the full force of his presence hit me. He was taller than I'd realized, powerfully built, every line of him coiled with contained energy. His dark hair was slightly tousled by the wind from the balcony, and his gray eyes, which had seemed so cold before, now held a flicker of something I couldn't decipher. It looked like pain. "This is a political marriage, Elara," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It serves a purpose. Your presence here solidifies my claim over the Silverwood lands and quiets the whispers of my rivals. In return, your pack is absolved of its debt. They will be protected under my banner. They will want for nothing." "And what is my role in this arrangement?" I asked, clutching my hands together to stop them from shaking. "You will be Luna," he said simply. "You will perform the public duties required of you. You will be seen at my side at formal events. You will be a symbol of this alliance. In all other matters, you are free to do as you wish, so long as you do not bring dishonor to this pack or to my name." He paused, his eyes scanning my face, and for a moment that raw hunger from the ceremony was back, a fleeting shadow in the depths of his gaze. "This marriage is a contract, nothing more. You have your own room. I will not touch you." The words should have been a relief. A part of me, the terrified girl who had been dreading this night, was screaming with gratitude. But another part, a part I didn't recognize, felt a strange sting of rejection. He had bought me, but he didn't want me. I was a trinket to be displayed on a shelf, not a woman to be cherished or even desired. The realization was a new kind of humiliation. Why? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Why go through all this if you don't want a wife? His jaw tightened, a muscle flexing in his cheek. My reasons are my own. They are not part of our contract. He turned back to the balcony, a clear dismissal. "Go to your room, Elara. We have nothing more to discuss." I stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching between us, thick with unspoken things. Then, with as much dignity as I could muster, I turned and walked to the adjoining door. My room was smaller than his, but still luxurious. A soft bed, a wardrobe filled with new clothes in the dark colors of the Black Moon pack, and a small sitting area with a window that overlooked a sheer cliff face. It was a beautiful prison cell. I sank onto the bed, the fine silk of the duvet cool against my skin. I had saved my family. I had done my duty. But as I sat there, alone in the heart of my enemy's fortress, I had never felt more lost. I had prepared for a monster, but I had been given an enigma. I had braced myself for brutality, but had been met with cold indifference. And somehow, that was infinitely worse. The ruthless alpha didn't want to break me. He just wanted to ignore me. And as I looked out at the unforgiving peaks surrounding me, I wondered which fate would be more damaging to my already fractured heart. The first few weeks passed in a blur of suffocating formality and echoing silence. I performed my duties as the silent, ornamental Luna. I sat beside Kael during meals in the Great Hall, the long table filled with his highest-ranking warriors and their mates. They spoke in low tones, their conversations carefully circling around me, their glances a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. I was the Silverwood Wolf, the outsider, the debt bride. I ate what was placed before me, kept my eyes down, and spoke only when spoken to, which was rarely. Kael was a constant, unnerving presence. We were two celestial bodies caught in a reluctant orbit, never touching, but always aware of the other's gravitational pull. He never entered my rooms, and I never entered his. The door between us remained a silent, unbreachable border. Yet I felt his eyes on me. When I walked through the fortress corridors, I would feel a prickling on my skin, and I would know he was watching from a high window. During meals, I would feel his gaze linger when he thought I wasn't looking. It wasn't desire, not in any way I understood it. It was assessment. He was watching me like a hawk watches a field mouse, trying to predict its every move. The isolation was a heavy cloak. The women of the pack, led by a sharp-faced she-wolf named Lyra, who was the mate of Kael's beta, Marcus, made their disdain clear. They saw me as a weakling from a failing pack, an unworthy Luna who had been bought rather than won. They would fall silent when I entered a room, their whispers following me like rustling leaves when I left. Desperate for a purpose, for something to do other than slowly fade away in my luxurious chambers, I began to explore. I avoided the main parts of the fortress where I was most likely to encounter hostile stares, and instead sought out the forgotten corners. That was how I found the greenhouses. Tucked away on a lower, sun-drenched terrace of the mountain, 3 vast structures of glass and iron stood against the stone. They were in a state of neglect. Panels of glass were cracked, weeds choked the pathways, and the plants inside were overgrown and dying of thirst. But beneath the decay, I could see what it once was, a source of life and sustenance for the pack. My mother had been a healer, a tender of herbs and gardens. She had taught me everything she knew. Walking into the dilapidated greenhouse felt like coming home. I started small, clearing a single bed of weeds, my hands sinking into the cool, rich earth. I found a well with a hand pump nearby and began the arduous task of watering. Day after day, I went to the greenhouse. I lost myself in the simple, honest work. I repaired the trellises, pruned the dying leaves, and coaxed life back into the soil. It was here, with dirt under my nails and sweat on my brow, that I finally felt like myself again. I wasn't Luna. I wasn't a treaty. I was just Ilara, a girl who knew how to make things grow. One afternoon, as I was carefully transplanting a struggling moonpetal plant, a shadow fell over me. I looked up to see Kael standing in the doorway, his massive frame blocking the light. My heart leaped into my throat. He had never sought me out before. He said nothing, simply watched me, his gray eyes sweeping over the work I had done. Over the past weeks, I had cleared nearly a third of the first greenhouse. The change was remarkable. New green shoots were pushing through the dark soil, and the air was filled with the scent of damp earth and living things. "What is this?" he finally asked, his voice a low rumble. I replied, my voice steady despite the frantic beating of my heart. I refused to be intimidated. This small corner of his world was mine now. The pack could have fresh herbs, vegetables, things to trade. It was a waste. He stepped inside, his boots crunching on the gravel path. He walked slowly down the aisle, his gaze sharp and assessing. He stopped by a bed of wolfsbane I had carefully cultivated. It was a tricky plant, poisonous if handled incorrectly, but essential for certain healing poultices. "My mother built these," he said, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. He ran a hand over a wooden support beam, a flicker of memory in his eyes. "She died when I was a boy. After she was gone, no one had the heart for it. They fell into ruin." It was the first piece of his past he had ever offered, a tiny crack in his stone facade. I found myself holding my breath. "My mother was a healer too," I said quietly. "She taught me." He looked at me then, truly looked at me, and the assessment was gone. In its place was something else, something deeper and more complex. It was a flicker of understanding, of shared loss. The moment stretched, a fragile thread connecting us across the vast, silent space of the greenhouse. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. The mask slammed back into place. His eyes became cold and distant again. "See that it is done properly," he said, his tone clipped and formal. "I will allocate whatever resources you require. Give a list to Greta." And then he was gone, leaving me with the ghost of a connection and a heart that was beating far too fast. He had pushed me away, but not before letting me see a glimpse of the man beneath the alpha. It was a dangerous glimpse. It gave me hope, and hope, I knew, was the most treacherous thing to have in a place like this. The greenhouse became my sanctuary, and unexpectedly, a bridge. Greta, following Kyle's orders, grudgingly provided me with supplies. A few of the older pack women, ones who remembered Kyle's mother and her gardens, began to visit. At first, they watched me from a distance, but soon they started to help, offering advice on the mountain soil and sharing stories of the Luna who had come before me. I learned that she had been a kind, gentle soul, beloved by the pack. Her death had changed everything. It had changed Kyle, turning a vibrant young heir into the cold, ruthless alpha he was today. My quiet work did not go unnoticed by Lyra and her circle. They saw my growing influence as a threat. One day, as I was leaving the greenhouse, Lyra and two of her friends blocked my path. "Playing in the dirt, little weed," Lyra sneered, her eyes glittering with malice. "You may have the alpha's momentary approval, but don't think for a second you belong here. You are a silverwood runt, a payment, nothing more." I met her gaze, my back straight. The girl who had trembled at her own wedding was gone. The dirt under my nails and the sun on my skin had reminded me who I was. "I am the Luna of this pack, Lyra, and these greenhouses will feed our people through the winter. That seems a more valuable contribution than spreading poison with your tongue." Her face contorted with rage. She took a step forward, her hand raised as if to strike me. But before she could, a low growl echoed from the pathway behind her. Marcus, her mate and Kyle's beta, stood there, his expression thunderous. "Lyra, enough," he commanded. His eyes met mine for a brief second, and in them I saw a flicker of respect. He had seen the exchange. Lyra hissed, but backed down, shooting me a look of pure hatred before storming off. The incident marked a subtle shift. I had not backed down. I had defended my position and my work. Marcus's intervention signaled that my standing was not as precarious as Lyra believed. The pack was watching, and some were starting to see me as more than just a bride price. The real test, however, came unexpectedly. An alarm bell rang through the fortress, a frantic, clanging peal that signaled a border breach. Rogues! A patrol had been ambushed. I rushed to the infirmary, my heart pounding. The pack's healer was an old man named Elric, knowledgeable but overwhelmed. Wounded warriors were being carried in, their bodies mangled, their blood staining the stone floors. One of them, a young man named Rhys, was fading fast. A deep gash in his side was bleeding profusely, and Elric couldn't stop it. "The wound is poisoned," Elric said, his hands shaking. "I don't have an antidote brewed." I looked at the wound, at the dark veins spreading from it. I recognized the poison. It was from the thorns of the shadow creeper vine, a nasty plant that grew in the ravines near our old border. I knew the antidote. "I can help," I said, my voice clear and certain. Elric looked at me, skeptical. But then Cale was there, his presence filling the crowded room. He had just returned from the battle, a cut on his cheek and his knuckles bloody, but his eyes were sharp and focused on me. "Let her," he commanded. There was no time to fetch ingredients. I looked around the infirmary frantically. I need charcoal, crushed silver thistle, and honey. They were common enough supplies. A warrior rushed to fetch them. I knelt by Rhys's side, tearing a clean strip of cloth from my dress. He was barely conscious, his breathing shallow. "Stay with me, Rhys," I said, placing a hand on his forehead. The supplies arrived. I worked quickly, my hands sure and steady. I mixed the charcoal and silver thistle into a thick paste with the honey and packed it firmly into the wound. It was a field remedy, something my mother had taught me for emergencies. It would draw the poison out. "It will not be enough to heal him, but it will stop the poison spread," I told Elric. "It will give you time to brew a proper antidote." I stayed by Rhys's side, monitoring his breathing while Elric and his assistants tended to the others. Slowly, miraculously, the dark veins began to recede. The bleeding slowed to a sluggish ooze. Color began to return to Rhys's face. I didn't realize Cale had been watching me the entire time until the chaos subsided. He stood in the corner of the infirmary, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. But as our eyes met across the room, I saw it again, that flicker of something other than cold indifference. It was respect. It was awe. He had seen me save one of his own. Later that night, exhausted, I was in my room when a knock came on the door connecting my chambers to his. My breath hitched. He had never come to this door before. I opened it slowly. Cale stood there, holding a small wooden box. He looked uncertain. It was an expression so alien on his face that it momentarily stunned me. "This was my mother's," he said, holding out the box. "She was a healer. I thought you should have it." My fingers trembled as I took it from him. It was beautifully carved with images of leaves and vines. I opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were a set of delicate silver tools, the kind used for preparing herbs and mixing salves. They were exquisite. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. It was more than a gift. It was an acceptance. "You saved him, Ilara," Cale said, his voice low. "Rhys is one of our best. You saved a warrior of the Black Moon Pack." "He is one of my pack now too," I replied, looking up at him. The space between us crackled with unspoken energy. He was so close I could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, could smell the scent of pine and cold mountain air that clung to him. He raised a hand as if to touch my face, his fingers hovering just inches from my cheek. I saw the battle in his eyes, the raw desire warring with a deep, ingrained pain. I saw him start to lean in, and then he flinched back as if burned. The mask of the Ruthless Alpha fell back into place, colder and harder than ever before. "Do not mistake my gratitude for anything more," he said, his voice a harsh rasp. "The terms of our arrangement have not changed." He turned and strode back into his room, shutting the door behind him with a soft but decisive click, leaving me breathless and trembling in the doorway. He had shown me the man, the grieving son, the grateful Alpha. And then he had ripped it all away, pushing me back into the cold loneliness of our contract. The emotional whiplash was dizzying. My heart ached with a confusion I couldn't name. He was drawing me in and pushing me away, and I was beginning to fear that the real danger wasn't the ruthless Alpha, but the broken man hidden beneath. And that man, I was terrified to admit, was the one I was starting to fall for. The push and pull became our new, agonizing rhythm. There were moments, like sparks in the darkness, where the wall between us would crumble. He would seek me out in the greenhouse, asking quiet questions about a particular plant, his voice stripped of its usual command. We discovered a shared interest in strategy, and once spent an entire evening before the Great Hall's fire mapping out patrol routes on a piece of parchment, our heads bent close together, our hands occasionally brushing. In those moments, he wasn't the fearsome Alpha, and I wasn't the debt bride. We were just Kyle and Alara. But for every step forward, he would force us 2 steps back. The morning after a shared moment of connection, he would be colder than ever, his orders clipped, his eyes refusing to meet mine. He would disappear for days at a time, leading patrols to the farthest reaches of his territory, returning haggard and grim, the wall around him rebuilt, thicker and more impenetrable than before. It was a maddening dance, and it was tearing me apart. I was living for the sparks, the brief flashes of the man I knew was underneath, and dying a little each time he snuffed them out. My position within the pack, however, was solidifying. The greenhouses were flourishing, providing not just food, but also valuable medicinal herbs that strengthened the pack's healers. The rescue of Reese had earned me the unwavering loyalty of the warriors. Even Lyra, while still hostile, had been forced into a grudging silence by the clear shift in public opinion, and, more importantly, in her mate Marcus's attitude towards me. I was becoming their Luna, in fact as well as in name. The only heart I hadn't won was my husband's, and I was beginning to realize, with a terrifying certainty, that it was the only one I truly wanted. One night, I was awakened by a sound from his chambers, a muffled cry of pain. It wasn't loud, but in the deep silence of the mountain fortress, it was as jarring as a scream. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart pounding. Was he injured? Was he sick? Hesitantly, I slipped out of bed and crept to the connecting door, pressing my ear against the cold wood. I heard it again, a low, guttural sound of pure agony, followed by a choked whisper, a name. Lyanna. My blood ran cold. I had heard that name before, whispered by the old women in the greenhouse. Lyanna, his first mate, the one who had died. Driven by a force I couldn't control, I pushed the door open. It was unlocked. I slipped into his room. A single candle burned on the nightstand, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Kale was thrashing in his massive bed, caught in the throes of a nightmare. His face was slick with sweat, his features contorted in a mask of torment. "No, Lyanna, run!" he gasped, his hands clenching the fur throw. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." My heart broke for him. The immense pain he kept locked away during the day was tormenting him in his sleep. I moved to the bed and gently, tentatively, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Kale," I whispered, "wake up. It's just a dream." His eyes flew open. They were wild, unfocused, still trapped in the horror of his memory. He lunged up, grabbing my wrist in a vice-like grip, his shifter strength terrifying. "Who are you?" he growled, his voice thick with sleep and fury. "It's me. It's Alara," I said, trying to keep my voice calm even as his grip tightened painfully. Recognition slowly dawned in his eyes, chasing away the nightmare shadows. But it was replaced by something worse, a cold, hard fury. He released my wrist as if my touch had burned him, shoving me away. "What are you doing in here?" he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I told you to stay out." "I heard you," I said, rubbing my bruised wrist. "You were having a nightmare. I was worried." "I don't need your pity," he spat, getting out of bed. He was wearing only a pair of dark pants, his chest bare. The moonlight from the balcony traced the hard lines of his muscles and the network of old scars that crisscrossed his skin. He was magnificent and terrifying. "You have no right to be in this room, no right to hear that name." "Lyanna," I whispered the name, and his entire body went rigid. "She was your mate, wasn't she? The women say she was killed." "Do not speak her name!" he roared, and the force of his alpha command slammed into me, making my knees buckle. It was a wave of pure, untempered rage. "You know nothing." "I know that whatever happened is tearing you apart," I cried, finding a strength I didn't know I possessed. "I know you hide in your work and your ruthlessness, but at night the ghosts come out. You can't command them away, can you?" He stared at me, his chest heaving, his eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and raw, exposed pain. He looked like a wolf caught in a trap, ready to chew off its own leg to escape. "Get out," he whispered, his voice dangerously low. "No," I said, standing my ground. "I'm your wife, Kale." "This contract, this arrangement, it doesn't stop me from seeing you. I see you're hurting. Let me help you." "Help me?" He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "You are the cause of this. Your pack's weakness, your father's foolish pride. That is why you are here. You are a constant reminder of the duties I despise, of the alliances I am forced to make to protect what is mine." The words were like slaps to the face, each one colder and more calculated than the last. He was using the truth as a weapon, twisting it to inflict the most damage. "This marriage," he continued, taking a menacing step towards me, his shadow swallowing me whole, "is a prison, and you are its warden. Do you think I could ever want someone who represents my chains? I look at you and I see obligation. I see a political necessity. I will never see a wife. I will never see a mate. I will never, ever feel anything for you." He had finally said it, the unspoken truth that had been hanging between us since the day we met. Each word was a perfectly aimed dagger, and they all found their mark in my heart. Tears I hadn't even realized were forming began to stream down my face. I had been a fool to hope, a fool to care, a fool to think the glimpses of the man he was meant anything at all. I saw a flicker of something in his eyes then. Regret? Horror at what he'd just done? But it was gone in an instant, buried again beneath the ice. He had shown me his deepest wound, and when I had tried to touch it, he had savaged me. Without another word, I turned and fled back to my room, shutting the door behind me. I leaned against it, my body shaking with silent sobs. The fracture between us was no longer a crack, it was a chasm. He had not just pushed me away, he had obliterated any bridge that had ever existed between us. He had made it brutally, painfully clear. He would rather live with his ghosts than let me into his heart. And in doing so, he had just created a new one to haunt me. The days that followed were a frozen hell. Kale and I were strangers living under the same roof. He was relentlessly cold, his every interaction with me stripped to the barest necessity. The warmth I had glimpsed was gone, replaced by an impenetrable wall of ice. He drove himself and his warriors mercilessly, as if trying to outrun the demons I had witnessed in his chambers. The entire fortress was cloaked in his grim mood. I threw myself into my work, my only solace. The greenhouses were thriving, a vibrant splash of life against the gray stone of the fortress and the gray misery of my existence. I expanded my work to the infirmary, organizing supplies, brewing remedies, and teaching some of the younger women the basics of healing. I built a life for myself in the spaces he did not occupy, carving out a small kingdom of purpose in the shadow of his rejection. The pack had accepted me as their Luna, but their Alpha treated me as less than a ghost. The first snows of winter began to fall, blanketing the mountain peaks in white. And with the snow came the danger Kale had been preparing for. Scouts returned with dire news. A large force of rogues and rival pack warriors was massing at our northern border. They were led by a notoriously vicious alpha named Fenrir, a wolf known for his brutality and his penchant for total annihilation. It was his pack that had long been a thorn in Kale's side. A war council was called. I took my place at Kale's side, a silent figure as he and his commanders planned their defense. As they spoke of troop movements and strategic points, I studied the map. The northern border they were focused on was a treacherous, rocky pass, difficult to defend. But I saw something they didn't. To the east, there was a series of old, forgotten logging trails that wound through the forest. Silverwood land, my land. I knew those trails like the back of my hand. They were a weakness, a back door into our territory that Fenrir could exploit. "They won't attack through the pass," I said, my voice cutting through the silence of the room. All eyes turned to me. Kale's gaze was hard, annoyed by my interruption. "That is the most direct route," Marcus stated, frowning. "It is also the most predictable," I countered, moving my finger to the map. "But here, these old trails, Fenrir could move a smaller, faster force through them under the cover of the forest. He could bypass the pass and strike at the heart of our territory before we even knew he was there." The commanders murmured amongst themselves, studying the map with new eyes. Kale stared at me, his expression unreadable, but I saw a flicker of grudging respect in his eyes. "She knows this land better than any of us," Marcus said to Kale. "We should heed her warning." Kale's jaw was tight. To accept my counsel was to admit my value beyond our contract. "Set a watch on the trails," he commanded curtly, not looking at me. "Double the patrols." My warning came too late. That very night, the attack came. And just as I had predicted, it came through the forest. Fenrir's forces were fast and brutal. They were not aiming for the fortress, but for the softer targets, the villages at the base of the mountain where most of the pack families lived. It was a strategy of terror. Chaos erupted. The warning bells tolled, and warriors scrambled to defend their homes. Kale was a storm of fury on the battlefield, his massive black wolf a blur of teeth and claws. But his forces were spread thin, caught off guard. I refused to cower in the fortress. I organized the women, turning the great hall into a makeshift infirmary and refuge for the children and the elderly. As the wounded were brought back from the fighting, I worked tirelessly, stitching wounds, setting bones, and offering what comfort I could. This was my pack now, and I would not let them suffer. In the midst of the chaos, a blood-soaked warrior stumbled in, gasping for breath. "They've broken through the eastern line," he choked out. "They're heading for the old mill, where the children were moved for safety." A cold dread washed over me. I looked around. All the able-bodied warriors were engaged in the main fight. There was no one to send. No one but me. I grabbed a healer's bag and a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. "Barricade the doors behind me," I told Greta, whose face was pale with fear. "Don't open them for anyone." I slipped out a side door and ran into the snowy night, my heart pounding in my ears. The sounds of battle were fainter here. I knew a shortcut to the old mill. As I raced through the snow-laden trees, my own shifter senses, long dormant and suppressed in my grief, began to awaken. I could smell the blood and the foul scent of the rogues on the wind. I was not a warrior, but I was an alpha's daughter, and I would die to protect the innocent. I arrived at the mill just as a small group of Fenrir's warriors were smashing the door down. I didn't hesitate. I let out a cry of rage and charged, swinging the heavy iron poker. I caught the first wolf by surprise, striking him hard across the side of the head. He went down with a yelp. The other two turned, their eyes wide with shock at the sight of the Luna, armed and furious. They were bigger, stronger, but I was fighting for more than just my life. I was fighting for the children huddled inside. I fought with a desperate ferocity I didn't know I possessed, dodging and weaving, using my smaller size to my advantage. But it wouldn't be enough. One of them lunged, knocking the poker from my hand, and his claws slashed across my arm. Pain, hot and sharp, exploded through me. I stumbled back, cornered against the mill wall, the wolf's snarling face just inches from mine. Suddenly, a black hurricane of fur and fury erupted from the trees. Kale! He must have heard the commotion. He slammed into my attacker, his jaws closing around the rogue's throat. The second wolf tried to flee, but Kyle was on him in an instant. The fight was over in seconds. Kyle stood over the bodies of our enemies, his massive form heaving, his fur matted with blood, theirs and his own. He shifted back, his human form seeming to materialize from the shadows. He rushed to my side, his eyes wild with a terror that ripped through all his defenses. "Elara," he breathed, his voice raw with emotion. He gently took my injured arm, his touch surprisingly tender. "You're hurt." "The children," I gasped, "are they safe?" "They are safe," he said, his gaze locked on my face. "Because of you. I saw what you did. You stood against them alone. You were willing to die for them, for my people." Tears streamed down his face, mingling with the blood and grime. The ruthless alpha was gone, stripped away by the horror of nearly losing me. In his place was the man, broken and terrified and beautiful. "I was so wrong," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I built walls of ice around my heart, thinking I was protecting myself, protecting you from the curse I believe I carry. Lyanna, she was killed by Fenrir's pack. They targeted her to weaken me. I swore I would never let anyone close again. I thought if I kept you at a distance, if I made you hate me, they wouldn't see you as a weakness. They wouldn't come for you." His confession poured out of him, a torrent of pain and regret. But I was a fool. Keeping you away was its own kind of death. Every day I watched you, saw your strength, your kindness, your spirit, and I fell in love with you. I married you to save my territory, Elara, but I was lying to myself. I married you because from the first moment I saw you, my wolf knew. It knew you were my true mate, and I was too much of a coward to accept it. He cradled my face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away my tears. "I don't want your duty. I don't want this contract. I only want your heart. If you'll still have mine." My own heart felt like it was going to burst. All the pain, the loneliness, the confusion, it all melted away in the heat of his confession. I looked into his stormy gray eyes and saw my future. I saw my home. "You've always had it," I whispered. He let out a shuddering breath of relief, and then his lips were on mine. It wasn't a kiss of gentle romance. It was a desperate, claiming kiss, filled with all the unspoken words, the pent-up longing, the terror, and the relief of the past months. It was a vow far more powerful than the one we had spoken at the altar. It was the sealing of a bond, not of pacts or politics, but of two broken souls who had finally found their way back to each other in the midst of war and snow. As he held me there amidst the carnage, I knew the battle for the Black Moon Pack was not over, but the battle for our hearts had just been won. The rest of the battle was a blur, with Kale fighting with the renewed fury of a male protecting his mate, and with the tactical advantage my knowledge of the land had provided. The Black Moon warriors rallied. They drove Fenrir's forces back from the villages and into the forests, harrying them until their broken remnants fled back into the winter wastes. The victory was decisive, but it had come at a cost. Many were wounded, and a few had fallen. The pack was bloodied but unbowed. Kale never left my side. After a kiss at the mill, he had swept me up into his arms and carried me back to the fortress infirmary himself, growling at anyone who dared to get too close. He stood watch as Elric stitched my arm, his hand resting on my shoulder, a silent, immovable guardian. The walls he had so carefully constructed were not just gone. They had been pulverized, reduced to dust by the force of his feelings for me. In the days that followed, the pack mourned its dead and tended to its wounded, but a new spirit filled the stone halls of the fortress. It was a spirit of hope. They had seen their Luna fight for their children. They had seen their Alpha fight for his Luna. The story of what had happened at the old mill spread like wildfire, cementing my place in their hearts forever. Lyra, upon hearing the tale, had come to me in the infirmary, her face pale, and offered a quiet, sincere apology. The war had burned away the old pettiness, leaving only the raw, unbreakable bonds of pack. My family arrived from Silverwood, my father looking healthier than he had in years. The protection and resources of the Black Moon Pack had worked wonders. He embraced me, tears in his eyes, telling me how proud he was. He looked at Kael, who stood beside me with a protective arm around my waist, and he saw not a conqueror, but a son. The two alphas clasped hands, and the alliance of our packs was finally sealed not by contract, but by kinship and mutual respect. One evening, after the last of the wounded were stable and the fortress had settled into a weary peace, Kael led me to his chambers. To our chambers. He had moved my things from the adjoining room. The silent, symbolic border between us was gone for good. He led me onto the balcony, wrapping a thick fur cloak around my shoulders. The night was clear and cold, the sky a canopy of brilliant stars. The snow-covered valley below glittered under the light of the full moon. "I never brought Lyanna here," he said softly, his breath misting in the air. We were young. It was a youthful bond, full of light and laughter. But it was never tested by darkness. What we have, Elara, it was forged in it. It's stronger, deeper. He turned me to face him, his hands cupping my face. His gray eyes, which had once been so stormy and cold, were now clear and filled with a love so profound it took my breath away. "I love you," he said, the words no longer tortured, but simple, powerful, and true. "You are not my second chance. You are my only chance, my fated mate, my Luna." My heart. I leaned into his touch, my own heart overflowing. "And you are mine," I whispered, pressing a kiss to his lips. We stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, under the silent watch of the moon. The cold stone fortress no longer felt like a prison, but a sanctuary. The ruthless Alpha was gone, replaced by a devoted, loving male who had fought through his own darkness to find the light. And the frightened, sacrificial bride had found her strength, her purpose, and her home. He held me close, his heart beating a steady, reassuring rhythm against my back. The heart I had fought for, the heart that was finally mine. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that our new beginning, born from sacrifice and battle, would be a love story whispered on the mountain winds for generations to come.